beautiful people, beautiful family, and thanks for joining me today in this part 19th of a journey that we have titled The Journey. And it's a very long journey in which we're covering the 5 core books of Ellen G. White. And we are on book number 1, which is titled Patriarchs and Prophets. We are on chapter 19 today, and chapter 19 is titled The Return to Canaan. So in the previous chapter, we had talked about how Jacob came back from Mesopotamia into the promised land, into the land of Canaan, and he was afraid, and he met with his brother eventually, and they hug and they're together. So this chapter picks up from that point on. And it starts by saying, this chapter, it's one of those chapters that talks a little bit about everything. So it has many different stories, very condensed. Again, this is why it is so important to remember that the study of these books does not substitute Bible study. Bible is to be studied concurrently with these books. And this particular chapter is based on Genesis chapters 34, 35, and 37. So it picks up, Jacob is in Canaan now. He's in the land of Shechem or Shechem. I'll write it here for you. Not sure which pronunciation is the right one. But he is in that land, which is in the land of Canaan. And God had promised that he was going to bring Jacob back safely. And he did so. And now Jacob is in the promised land. And before he finally settles, he's in the land of Shechem, again, or Shechem. I'm going to say Shechem from now on. And before he fully settles, he experienced awfulness. So his sons, his 2 elder sons, they get upset because their sister gets defiled by another young person who didn't know what he was doing, I guess. And because of this defilement, the sons of Jacob, again, I'm not going to go into details, you can read the story in the Bible, but they basically committed murder to an entire city. They deceived the city into getting into a covenant with them, and then they murdered them all, the inhabitants of the city. And because of this, of course, Jacob was afraid, because now he's just getting back to the land of Canaan, and he has used, his family has just murdered an entire people. He's afraid that the other people in the surrounding areas are gonna, join together and go and attack him, and of course eliminate his family. In the scaredness of it all, Ellen White makes a little pause here to talk about how Jacob was raised with the Christian moral values, let's call them that. And he, of course, shared those with his children. But what happened? His children were a bit wicked to some degree. And in the book here, it says that they actually started committing idolatry. And it ties the divergence from honoring God to parenting. Once again, we've seen this trend over and over and over through the previous chapters. And Jacob, even though he honored God, we got to remember that he had children that witnessed Jacob in polygamy. So Jacob had 2 wives, and then aside from 2 wives, he, slept with the handmaidens of his wife, so at least 4 women. And that's not the plan of God. The marriage, as God intended, has always been 1 man, 1 woman. So Jacob, even though he honored God, he made his children witness some ungodly acts. And of course, as these ungodly acts proliferate, the children are witness to this, and now these children, even though they have a core of godly values, they did have earthly given values, which are not values at all, but you get the point. So they of course were wicked children, and they killed that city. So Jacob asked for guidance, and God instructs them to go to another city far from there. And as he goes far from there, he's with his brother Esau. But once again, we see the same trend we've been seeing. Esau was not a man of God. Jacob was a man of God. Jacob had many earthly, possessions, like he has wealth, and Esau did too. And at this point, even though they're brothers, they figured out it's better for them to split up. And once again, we see this separation of the people of God from the people of the earth, because in order for God to have a successful lineage, he needs to keep his people as far away possible from the temptations of, the earth, of the world. And we see this from Abraham, when Abraham was called out of his city. We see it with Isaac, we see it now with Jacob, and over, God is trying to pull his people away from the temptations of the earth, of the world, so that he can instruct them and guide them and shape their characters. So we see that again. Now, it continues talking about, about how the life of Jacob was in the Canaan land. But then it completely shifts scope. It goes from talking about the beginnings of Jacob settling in Canaan to the story of Joseph, which is one of my favorite stories in the Bible. And that's where it gets, I guess, for me, because it's one of my favorite stories, super interesting. Now, one final point that I do want to make about Jacob and Esau. God had no preference for Jacob over Esau. That is not in the Bible. Esau deliberately chose to not necessarily obey and follow God's commandments and rules. So there wasn't any predisposition that Jacob was going to be favored over Esau. God would have blessed Esau just as he did Jacob. But it was Esau's own decision, on his free will. He chose not to, follow God. And that, it says here, to that point, there was no arbitrary choice on the part of God by which Esau was shut out from the blessing of salvation. The gifts of his grace through Christ are free for all. So, lesson to us, we are free to choose. God will not choose for us. God talks to us in different ways. God teaches us. God, gave us the Bible so that we can study. But it is ultimately up to you, up to me, up to us as individuals to decide to follow God or not. So now we jump into the story of Joseph. Again, this book supplements the Bible. So it, of course, doesn't go in as much details into the stories as the Bible does, and sometimes in more details than the Bible does. But once again, Bible comes first. So in the story of Joseph, most of us know that story. Joseph was the firstborn of Rachel, and Rachel was Jacob's true wife, let's call it like that. He loved Rachel. Rachel is the one he wanted to marry from the beginning, but he was deceived by his uncle Laban and gave Leah instead. So he had two wives, but in reality, all he wanted from the beginning was Rachel. So now Rachel has his son Joseph. So this is a child that is born from his, let's call her, favorite wife. So obviously he has some unwarranted special love for Joseph. And to top it all off, as I said, Jacob's brothers, or his previous sons, were wicked to some degrees. They weren't really, they had, they believed in polygamy, they had idols, the two older brothers murdered an entire city, so they were not the best examples of moral values in life. But Joseph was different. Joseph was pleased to honor God, was pleased to obey his father. He just had a different attitude and character. And again, same that Jacob and Esau, all these brothers are being raised in the same environment, in the same moral values. Jacob is teaching them all together, but each chose whatever they wanted to do eventually. So because of Joseph's natural tendency to obey God, to honor God, of course, Jacob loved him more perhaps than he should have. And it says here that, it clarifies that Jacob did not knew the error that he was committing by favoring Joseph. So Joseph is being favored, and we know the story. Jacob makes eventually a tunic of different colors, which I had the opportunity to be in Israel not too long ago, right before the war, and I saw a person showed us how in the ancient times they used to make threads from like sheep hair, and then how they colored these threads so that, you know, clothes had different colors. And it's a very, very arduous and extensive and hard process. So one can imagine, once I saw that, it was mind-blowing to me, because I could finally picture exactly why the brothers were so jealous. These things took a lot of time to make. So different colors, you have to individually paint each of the threads. There were not industrial machinery or equipment. You basically have to roll the hair to make the thread, and then with different spices or different fruits or different vegetables, they have to rub this, you know, this thread with the color, with the vegetables, so that they get the color they want. So if you want green, I don't know, you would use like celery or something like that. If you want red, you would use tomato. So it was an expensive, tedious, and long task. So Jacob, for him to make a tunic for Joseph of color, he invested a lot of time doing this. And of course, the brothers were extremely jealous, but they hid very well from his father their true feelings towards Joseph. And then to finally tip the scales, Joseph had two dreams. And in both dreams, he was the center of attention, so in a sense. And then his 12 brothers, his 12 brothers basically bowed down to him. So of course, this increased the jealousy, because they were thinking, okay, this guy thinks he's going to be, we're going to serve him, or we're going to be his subordinates. So they definitely, Joseph's brothers definitely didn't like him very much. Now, the story tells that the Joseph brothers were, of course, shepherds, and they were, taking care of the cattle and of the sheep. And because it was such an abundant cattle, they ran out of grass to eat. So they had to go to other places in the surrounding area so that they could feed, the animals. And in this particular case, they go to Shechem, which, as you remember, is the city where Jacob had to flee because they murdered an entire population there. So they go to Shechem, Jacob and Joseph stay back, and it's been a few days now, and Jacob starts to worry, because he's thinking in his mind, well, we did the horrible act in the past. Maybe, the people here, the people there want to take revenge. In his preoccupation, Jacob sends Joseph, not knowing that his brothers hated him, sends Joseph to check on his brothers. Jacob makes the 75 miles journey, only to find out that his brothers were not happy with his presence. They take him captive. They originally wanted to murder him, but the eldest brother, Reuben, he did not want to murder. He did not want the blood of his brother in his hands, so he convinced them to just take Joseph and throw him in a ditch and let him there to die, with the intention of later getting him out and bringing him back to his father. But they throw him into the ditch. The nighttime comes, and a caravan of traders come by. These were Ishmaelites traders, and they were on their way to Egypt. So one of the brothers had the brilliant idea. They had a bit of conscience of maybe we should not let him die, but they didn't want him nearby. And here's a key point, and I actually want to read this, because this is Satan's favorite temptation to most of us. Some were moved with pity, but fear of derision kept them silent. All felt that they had now gone too far to retreat. This was the case at creation. This was the case for Satan himself in heaven. Over and over and over, Satan tries to convince you, to convince me, to convince humanity that we have just gone too far from God to be saved. And in some cases it works, in some other cases, hopefully not yours, it doesn't, because we know that there's nothing we can do that will take us far enough from God that He cannot reach us. But in this particular case, it did work. They thought they had gone too far, so they sell Joseph to this caravan of traders and ship him off to Egypt. And that's where the second chapter, not the second, but the next chapter will pick off. This is chapter 19, the return to Canaan. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you next time.